The fog lay heavy over the marsh that morning, a pale, shifting veil that blurred the line between earth and sky. The reeds stood stiff and silent, their tips jeweled with droplets of dew that barely stirred in the breathless air. Beneath the dim gray light, the ground squelched faintly underfoot, releasing the slow, fetid scent of decay, half-rotting vegetation, half something older, darker, that seemed to seep from the earth's own depths. The water sat slick and black in shallow pools, reflecting the murky sky like bruised glass. Every sound, from the creak of damp wood to the distant caw of a crow, felt dulled, as though the marsh itself were listening. Amara stood at the very edge where firmer soil surrendered to the sucking mire, her boots just a half-step away from disappearing into the ooze. Her hair, a dark curtain against her pale face, clung in damp strands to her cheeks. She kept her gaze steady on the shifting mist, refusing to look at the figures fanning out behind her. There were 6 of them, all villagers she had known since childhood, faces she had once greeted with kindness at the market, now twisted with the satisfaction of people who believed themselves righteous. The accusations had been whispered for weeks, growing louder with each passing day. Strange weather? Amara's fault. A cow sickening in the night? She must have cursed it. A sudden fever sweeping through a family? Surely her doing. They had no proof, only fear, and fear needed somewhere to go. She had heard the mutters in the square, the way people avoided her eyes, the quick crossing of themselves when she passed. And now, in the cold hush of dawn, they had come to make their fear into something final. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a hooked nose, stepped closer. "We know what you are," he said, his voice low but trembling with the rush of the moment. "We've all seen enough to know. This place will take you. Let it have you and you'll trouble us no more." His breath puffed white in the air as he looked to the others for approval. They nodded, their faces pale in the mist, their eyes shining with a strange blend of terror and triumph. Amara didn't answer. Her hands hung loose at her sides, the fingers slightly curled, and her breathing was slow, measured. She could feel the pulse of the marsh under her feet, subtle, deep, like the thud of a distant drum. It was a sensation she had known since childhood, walking these banks alone, feeling the land shift and breathe as if it were alive. The villagers thought they had chosen this place for her ending. They did not realize it was a place that had already chosen her. Someone shoved her from behind. The world lurched, her arms windmilling to keep balance, but her foot sank past the rim of the bank, into cold that clutched like a living hand. Mud oozed around her ankle, seeping into her boot, icy enough to sting. The smell of rot rose thick and cloying, a mix of stagnant water and decomposed matter, the breath of something that had been buried too long. She staggered forward, trying to pull free, but the ground gave way entirely beneath her next step, swallowing her calf, then her knee. The marsh made no sound. No splash, no rippling of water, only the faint, obscene gurgle of the mud closing around her. The reeds swayed once, though there was no wind. She could feel the weight of their stares at her back, the villagers watching with the tight anticipation of people waiting for a cruel task to be complete. Her breath came in sharp bursts as the cold climbed higher, tugging at her hips. She could feel the mud's strange, slow grip, not just dragging her down but pulling her in, as though there were space beneath, a hollow deep enough to hold her whole. But there was no panic in her face. Her eyes remained fixed on the mist ahead, where shapes moved that were not men or women. They were darker than the fog, flickering between one blink and the next, and the longer she looked at them, the more the air seemed to thicken around her. Behind her, one of the villagers laughed too loudly, the sound cracking. "See how the earth knows her. It'll be done quick." But his voice faltered on the last word, glancing nervously at the stillness that hung over the marsh like a drawn breath. The mud reached her waist. She could feel the thrum of the ground's heartbeat now, a low, resonant rhythm that seemed to echo in her own chest. It was ancient and patient, like something that had been waiting, watching, knowing the moment would come. The villagers shifted restlessly, a few casting glances at the ground beneath their own feet. Amara tilted her head slightly, not to look back at them, but as though she heard something deep within the earth that they could not. Her lips curved into the faintest trace of a smile, strange in its calm, almost knowing in its certainty. The mist rolled thicker, curling around ankles, clinging to legs. The marsh's silence was no longer the absence of sound. It was a presence, heavy and close, wrapping itself around them all. Somewhere beneath, the mud stirred. And though none of them realized it yet, it was not her weight it meant to keep. Before the whispers turned sharp enough to cut, Amara's days had been filled with the quiet, deliberate rhythm of tending to life in a place most people feared. She lived in a small thatched cottage at the marsh's edge, where the ground was soft enough for her to feel the give of the earth under every step and the air always smelled faintly of damp moss and flowering reeds. Her mornings began with the soft slap of water against the banks, the trill of hidden birds, and the occasional low groan of shifting mud deep below. At first light, she would wrap her faded shawl around her shoulders and set out with a woven basket, moving along narrow, twisting paths that only she seemed to know. Her fingers brushed the tops of grasses heavy with dew, her boots sinking slightly into the forgiving earth. She knew where to find the marsh mint whose sharp scent could clear a fevered head, the clusters of golden marsh marigold whose roots eased aching joints, and the elusive ghost orchids that only bloomed in places where the ground could swallow a careless step whole. Most people saw the marsh as a danger, an unpredictable trap, but to Amara, it was a patient, living thing, offering its gifts only to those who treated it with respect. When travelers came through the village, merchants heading to larger markets or wandering herbalists in search of rare plants, it was always Amara they sought to guide them across the wetland. She could read the way the reeds bent to find hidden pockets of firm ground, or how a change in the pattern of bird calls meant deeper water ahead. She knew where the leeches were thick, where quick mud lay in wait beneath deceptively solid moss, and where the pale, soft earth could hold a man's weight if he shifted carefully enough. To her, the marsh was not an enemy but an old friend whose moods could be read and whose boundaries could be trusted, so long as you listened. In the village she was both useful and strange. Mothers brought their sick children to her, and she would grind herbs in a stone mortar, steep them into teas, or wrap them in warm poultices until the fever broke. She stitched cuts with a steady hand, cleaned wounds with boiling water and bark-infused rinses, and sat for hours beside the elderly, whispering soothing stories of the marsh's changing seasons. Her cures worked often enough that some called her a blessing, while others muttered that she had help from things unseen. The whispers began long before the accusations. They called her marsh-born, though she had been born in the village like anyone else. Some said she could speak to the herons that followed her along the bank, or that the frogs sang louder when she passed. A few swore they had seen the mud itself firm beneath her steps in places where anyone else would have sunk. Amara never corrected these stories. Truth and rumor both slid off her like water off a reed, but she noticed when the glances she received in the market began to linger a little too long, when hands tightened on baskets as she passed. Still she lived simply. Her evenings were for boiling herbs over a small fire, drying plants from the day's gathering, and writing her observations in a book bound in cracked leather. She often left her door open to the night air, letting in the low drone of insects and the gentle slap of water on the banks. Sometimes she would sit by the threshold in silence, gazing across the moonlit marsh where mist curled like the breath of some sleeping creature. She had learned its language long ago, the way a sudden stillness meant the watchful eyes of a predator in the shallows, or how a rising ripple without wind was the marsh shifting in its slow tidal way. Children sometimes crept to her door in the evenings, pretending to be brave, daring each other to touch her steps or knock before running away. She never chased them, only left small bundles of dried herbs tied with reed cord on the outer post. A week later their mothers would come quietly to collect more, their eyes avoiding hers. She never thought of herself as anything but ordinary. Her connection to the marsh was born of attention and respect, not magic. But in a place where fear could grow faster than any weed, respect for something dangerous was too easily mistaken for allegiance to it. The marsh had kept her secrets for years and she had kept its, until the day came when the village decided those secrets were dangerous enough to destroy. Even then, in the months before that dawn at the water's edge, the marsh had already begun to watch more closely, as if sensing the tide of envy and suspicion rising against her. It waited. She didn't yet know that it was waiting not just for her, but for them. The resentment began as a murmur, curling like smoke in the dim corners of the tavern where the landowner and his chosen circle gathered. Garin, the man whose family claimed the largest tract of land near the marsh, had been watching Amara for years with a calculating eye. To him, the wetland was wasted space, miles of spongy, fertile soil that could feed wheat, barley and grazing cattle if only it could be drained. But Amara, with her influence and her quiet, stubborn loyalty to the marsh, was the single most immovable stone in his path. It wasn't just her knowledge of the wetland's depths that frustrated him, it was the way the villagers trusted her more than they trusted him. When floods threatened in the spring they asked Amara if it was safe to plant, not Garin. When a traveler went missing they sent for her to lead the search, not him. Even when his own wife fell ill, it was Amara's herbs that eased her fever. Every time she succeeded, the balance of respect tilted further away from his name. His son Joran was the sharp edge Garin needed. Where Garin's ambition came with years of patience, Joran's was hungry, impatient and cruel. He mocked Amara openly, calling her bog witch in the market square, and laughed when she ignored him. To him, her silence was proof of guilt. "If she's not hiding something," he once said to the group that clustered around his father's table, "why doesn't she defend herself? She thinks she's untouchable." His words fanned the embers of suspicion in those who were already uneasy with the marsh and all it represented. Around the table sat others who had long held small grievances, petty grudges that, in the warmth of their plotting, grew into something sharper. There was Keta, whose brother had drowned years ago in a part of the marsh Amara had warned him not to cross. To Keta, Amara's warning was not proof of wisdom but evidence she had somehow known what would happen. There was Bran, a fisherman whose traps had failed for 2 seasons straight, who muttered that the marsh's creatures listened to Amara more than they did to him. And there were the easily swayed, the ones who feared what they didn't understand and preferred an enemy they could point to over the uncertainty of the wetlands' mysteries. Their meetings were quiet at first, held under the pretense of discussing the poor harvest or the need for more farmland. But gradually the talk shifted. How strange it was that Amara never sank into the mud where others would, how she always knew where to find the rarest plants, how the marsh never seemed to harm her. It was Garen who first said it aloud, voice low and deliberate, "The marsh protects her." In that moment, the murmurs became something heavier, a collective certainty they would feed until it justified whatever they decided to do. They began twisting her kindness into signs of danger. When she left small bundles of herbs at a sick family's doorstep, they whispered it was a spell to bind the household to her. When she led strangers safely through the bog, they said she was showing them the hidden paths so they could return as thieves. And when a child wandered too close to the marsh but was found unharmed, they claimed she had called the reeds back with magic, proving she had power over life and death there. By late summer the plan was set, though no one said it in plain words. They spoke of freeing the land, of ending the unnatural hold she had on the villagers, of protecting their children from whatever evil the marsh hid. The more they spoke, the less they needed evidence. Suspicion became truth simply by being repeated often enough. One night, in the flickering light of the tavern's back room, Garen laid his hand flat on the table and said, "The marsh will take her back. We'll make sure of it." No one argued. Outside, the fog rolled in from the wetland like a living thing, pressing against the windows as though it had overheard them. It began with urgent knocking at her door just after sunrise, the kind of pounding that spoke of fear rather than formality. Amara opened it to find Keta standing there, breathless and wild-eyed, claiming that a child had gone missing near the southern edge of the marsh. The story spilled out in frantic fragments. A boy chasing a stray goat into the fog, footprints leading toward the sinking ground. The urgency left no room for suspicion. Amara grabbed her satchel without hesitation, stuffing it with a coil of rope, a flask of clean water, and a bundle of marshreed salve for cuts and insect bites. She followed Keta into the thinning light of morning, the mist hanging low and cool on her skin. It was a familiar dampness, the marsh greeting her as it always did, though today its silence felt heavier, its breath slower. When they reached the meeting point, an open patch of flattened reeds where she often started her rescue searches, 6 villagers were already there. Garen stood among them, his broad frame blotting out the pale glow of dawn. Joran leaned on a staff like a casual observer, but his eyes glinted with something sharper than concern. The others shifted uneasily, their faces carefully arranged in expressions of grim purpose. "We think he went this way," Garen said, pointing toward the dense wall of mist curling over the waterlogged ground. His voice was steady, but it carried the clipped tone of someone reciting a part in a play. "You know the safest routes. Let us." Amara stepped forward, scanning the wetland as she always did, letting the subtle shifts in the air and the rustle of unseen creatures tell her where to go. She moved toward a narrow stretch where water pooled dark and still, bordered by tufts of grass that seemed to tremble in the breeze. She didn't notice at first that the group had closed in behind her, the sound of their boots squelching in the mud becoming an enclosing circle. When she glanced back, there was no child's voice, no panicked bleating of a goat, only their eyes fixed on her. The mist thickened suddenly, swallowing the marsh's edges so the world shrank to a pale, ghostly bubble. "What is this?" she asked, though her voice carried more confusion than fear. But no one answered. Joran was the first to step forward, his grin a cold slice in the dim light. "You've had your hold over this village long enough," he said. "The marsh may love you, but it will love you even more once you're part of it." Before she could move, Garen's heavy hand struck her shoulders, driving her backward. Others joined, hands shoving, boots sliding in the mud, voices sharp with a strange, fevered triumph. The ground beneath her feet shifted from spongy earth to slick muck, sucking at her boots. Her arms pinwheeled for balance, but another push sent her stumbling deeper, the mud seizing her legs with greedy strength. Cold closed around her calves, her knees, her waist. The stench of rot and wet earth filled her lungs. The world tilted in soundless slow motion as she sank further, the circle of faces above her framed by the ghost-white shroud of mist. They didn't cheer or curse. They simply watched, breathing hard as if the marsh itself were swallowing her on command. The last thing she saw before the reeds bent over her head was Joran's smirk fading into a flicker of doubt. Then the surface closed, the pale fog above becoming a distant sky, and the marsh's silence folded around her like a living hand. At first, Amara braced for the inevitable, the crushing weight of mud filling her lungs, the suffocating pull downward into the cold dark. But instead of swallowing her whole, the marsh seemed to pause as if tasting her presence. The sucking pull around her legs eased. She felt the strange pressure of movement beneath the surface, not the wild thrashing of fish or the sluggish drift of eels, but a slow, deliberate stirring. Something touched her ankle, not sharp, not threatening, but warm in its way as if the earth itself had fingers. It was a root, thick and strong, curling gently around her shin. Another pressed at her waist, firm but supportive, guiding her sideways through the mud instead of downward. Amara's eyes were closed, but she could feel the path they were opening for her. Small pockets of air hidden in the muck like secret rooms, their stale breath enough to keep her from choking. She floated there, suspended in the dense embrace of soil and water, her heartbeat slowing in time with the deep, muffled rhythm of the marsh. Above her, faint shapes moved, boots shifting nervously, shadows blurring through the thin barrier of mud. She could not hear their voices clearly now, the earth muted them into meaningless hums. A new sensation came then, not touch but presence. It pressed lightly at the edges of her thoughts, neither male nor female, neither old nor young. It was simply there, vast and patient, like the awareness of a predator who could afford to watch for hours before striking. But there was no hunger in it, not toward her. It was the same attention she'd felt as a child wandering the reeds alone, when dragonflies landed on her hands without fear and the water lilies tilted as if to greet her. She understood without words. The marsh knew her. The roots shifted again, cradling her with the care of something ancient and deliberate. Her body drifted sideways through a channel of loosened silt, her skin brushing against tangles of weed and hollow reeds that released faint bubbles around her face. The marsh's breath smelled of wet stone and hidden decay, but it was life, not death, that she felt in it. Somewhere above, a faint splash echoed, someone stepping too close to the unstable edge. The marsh's awareness sharpened. Amara could sense it focusing, the same way a heron's head snaps toward its prey. Beneath the muck, the roots flexed in readiness like muscles coiling for a strike. She realized then that she was not being hidden simply for her safety. The marsh was watching through her. She could feel its patience, its slow, building intent. It was waiting, calculating. Every reed and ripple seemed connected, all moving to the rhythm of some deep intelligence. A small shiver passed through her, not of fear but of awe. The villagers thought the marsh was only mud and water, dangerous because it was treacherous underfoot. They had no idea it was alive in a way they couldn't imagine. And now it was awake, fully aware of the violence that had been done. Another root curled across her chest, not constricting but steadying her as the currents shifted. She realized she could breathe without panic, her body adapting to the rhythm of this submerged place. The pressure on her ears eased, the weight of mud no longer pressed painfully on her lungs. She kept still, letting the marsh hold her. Above, the shuffling and murmuring grew more agitated. She could almost sense the way the surface shifted around their boots, the slow creep of water seeping over solid ground that was no longer as solid as they thought. The marsh had not let her die. It had taken her in as one of its own. And from the patient tension in its unseen limbs, she knew it was not finished. The laughter started as a low, smug chuckle from the landowner's son, who stood closest to the marsh's rim, his boots dark with wet silt. "See," he called to the others, glancing at the faint ripples where Amara had vanished. "The witch is gone. The marsh knows its place." A few others joined in, the sound sharp and brittle in the damp air, like sticks snapping. Mist curled between them, soft and low, and the smell of rotting reeds thickened. Beneath their feet, the mud gave a subtle sigh, shifting almost imperceptibly. The first to notice was one of the older men, who stepped back and frowned at the wet ground clinging to his boots. "It's soft here," he muttered, trying to shake free. The movement made a wet, sucking sound that lingered a beat too long before releasing him. The landowner waved him off. "It's a marsh, old man. It's always soft. His voice carried forced confidence, but his foot shifted more carefully now. The mud seemed to cling tighter with every step, as though something below had taken hold. Another man swore softly. He tugged at his leg, and when it came free his boot was missing. He turned, confused, peering into the shallow water where it should have bobbed to the surface. Instead, the dark hole where his foot had been remained open for several seconds, glistening as if something beneath were breathing. A nervous laugh broke the tension, high-pitched and short-lived. "Just bad footing," someone said, but the words felt thin in the heavy air. The mist pressed closer, shrouding their knees, hiding the true depth of the ground beneath. The landowner's son shifted his stance, and a ripple of movement passed under the muck, so faint it could have been the wind. Yet the sensation that followed, cold, deliberate pressure against his ankle, made his breath catch. He looked down but saw only black water and patches of reed swaying without wind. "It's holding," he started, but stopped when he realized how absurd it sounded. Still, the unease spread like the mist itself. Their laughter faded, replaced by small, clipped words and darting glances at one another. From somewhere deep in the marsh came a slow, hollow gurgle, the kind of sound water makes when it escapes through something thick and unseen. None of them moved for a moment. Then, as if on cue, they all stepped back, only to feel the ground resist. The sucking was stronger now, the grip of the earth firmer, as if the marsh had decided it no longer wished to let them leave. The older man who'd lost his boot swore again, louder this time, pulling hard at his leg. It came free with a splash, but the movement sent tiny ripples across the surface that vanished too quickly, swallowed by something beneath. "Enough," the landowner snapped, though his voice carried less authority than before. "We'll head back." But even as he turned, the mist thickened into an almost solid wall, hiding the path they'd taken to get here. The air felt heavier, the damp clinging to their skin like a second layer, and the smell of rot grew richer, almost sweet. No one laughed anymore. The marsh was no longer just wet ground to them, it was something watching, something waiting. And though none would admit it aloud, each man felt the same uneasy truth pressing in. The place they thought was their weapon had chosen a different target. It happened so fast, none of them could agree later on exactly how it began. One moment Rawl, the miller's cousin, was cursing at the mud sucking at his boots. The next, the ground beneath him gave way with a wet, greedy slurp, and he was sinking up to his knees. He froze, eyes wide, arms flailing for balance. "Help me," he barked, voice cracking as the muck began to tug harder, each pull slow but relentless. Two men rushed to his side, grabbing at his arms, but the moment they set their feet beside him, the ground shivered and sagged, clutching at them too. It wasn't like ordinary sinking ground. This was steady, purposeful, like fingers curling around their legs from below. The landowner's son grabbed a branch from the reeds and shoved it toward Rawl, but the wood barely reached him before the man's knees disappeared. The marsh gave a sound, low, wet, and disturbingly like a sigh of satisfaction. "Pull," someone yelled. They heaved together, their muscles straining, but every movement seemed to drag Rawl deeper. The mud was no longer just clinging, it was gripping, twisting slightly as though to find a better hold. The jeers that had filled the air earlier were gone, replaced by sharp, panicked shouts. "It's not letting go," one man cried, his voice almost breaking. Rawl's hands slipped against the damp arms trying to save him, his palms slick with mud and fear. Something unseen below shifted again, a slow spiral of motion. The helpers staggered as the ground trembled under their feet, and one yelped when a sudden tug nearly pulled him forward into the same pit. He stumbled back, bootless, mud clinging in thick ropes to his bare foot. Rawl's cries grew hoarse, his face pale and damp with mist. "Don't let—" The rest of his plea was cut off as the marsh lurched, pulling him down to his thighs in a single sickening gulp. His upper body jerked forward violently, forcing the rescuers to let go or be dragged with him. The landowner himself stepped forward then, grabbing Rawl's shoulders, his face twisted with effort. For a moment the pull seemed to ease. Then a sharp, cold ripple passed over their boots, and the mud tightened like a closing fist. "Back!" one of the older men shouted, stumbling away, but the others hesitated, unwilling to leave Rawl. That hesitation cost them. With a final wet sucking sound, the marsh yanked him down to the waist, his arms flailing wildly before he was pulled to the chest. The mist thickened, curling around them, muffling the desperate noises. Rawl's eyes met the landowner's one last time, wide, disbelieving, before his head dipped under the surface. The mud smoothed over in seconds, erasing all sign he had been there. Only a single bubble rose and popped in the silence that followed. The men stood panting, boots squelching, hearts hammering in their chests. None of them spoke it aloud, but every one of them knew, the marsh had chosen its first. Under the surface, the world was dim and muffled, the heavy weight of the marsh pressing against every inch of her skin. Amara did not fight it. She let herself sink into the sensation, let the silt curl around her like a thick, cool blanket. The moment she had slipped beneath, panic had threatened to claw up her throat, but the marsh had caught her, quite literally, before fear could root too deeply. A cradle of gnarled roots had wrapped around her torso and legs, holding her steady in a hollow just big enough to breathe. The air here was damp and tasted faintly of moss and mineral, but it was air nonetheless. She took slow, deliberate breaths, feeling the way the roots expanded and shifted as though making room for her lungs to fill. She could sense life all around, tiny movements of water beetles in the silt, the subtle sway of weed-like tendrils that brushed her arms, the deep, steady thrum beneath her that was not her own heartbeat. It was older than she could comprehend, slow and patient but powerful, like the pull of the moon on tides. The marsh's voice, if it could be called that, was not one of words but of feelings, thick, primal impressions that slid into her mind. Rage, yes, but not blind rage. This was a steady, purposeful anger, cold at its core but burning at the edges. It did not rage for itself, it raged for her. In that silent communion she understood. The marsh had watched her walk its edges for years, gathering herbs without greed, tending the plants that thrived in its damp soil, returning injured creatures to the water. She had moved through it as though she belonged, and in return, it had accepted her, though she had never fully grasped the depth of that acceptance until now. Above, muffled and distant, came the sounds of shouting and movement. The vibrations in the water carried the frantic stomps and splashes of her attackers. She felt the way the marsh stiffened around them, its patience thinning, its intent sharpening. Her fingers brushed over one of the thicker roots holding her aloft, tracing its rough, damp texture. It pulsed faintly under her touch, as though it could feel her gratitude. She closed her eyes, let her heartbeat fall into rhythm with that deeper, slower thrum, and allowed herself to trust it fully. The silt stirred against her ankles, curling in gentle patterns. She realized it was breathing with her, drawing water in, letting it out in a steady exchange. The sense of safety that washed over her was unlike anything she had ever felt, not even in her own home. Here the air was limited, the space confined, yet she felt expansive, as though she had become part of something far larger than herself. The marsh did not speak in sentences, but a single, undeniable truth settled into her bones. You are under my care now. A ripple of motion passed above her, and she knew without seeing that another had been caught in the marsh's grasp. The vibrations in the roots shifted slightly, a soft hum of satisfaction passing through them. She inhaled slowly, deliberately, her breath in sync with the ancient rhythm of the wetland. The water around her was cool but never biting, the mud dense but never suffocating. It held her in balance, buoyant enough to keep her from sinking, weighted enough to keep her hidden. The roots shifted minutely when she moved her head, almost like a hand adjusting a blanket over a resting child. Time became strange down here. It wasn't measured in moments or minutes but in breaths and heartbeats, in the slow curling of currents and the muted thuds of boots above. Every sound from the surface came to her in distorted echoes, as though the marsh was filtering them, keeping her safe from the harshness of the human world she had just left. She thought briefly of struggling upward, of trying to return to the bank, but the marsh's steady pressure against her limbs was firm, urging patience. She understood that it wasn't just hiding her, it was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting to finish what it had begun. And she would wait with it. Her eyes closed again and she let her mind drift, feeling herself dissolve into the wet darkness. She no longer felt entirely separate from the roots holding her or the mud surrounding her. She was part of the marsh now and the marsh was part of her. Above, a scream pierced the fog, muffled but unmistakable. She did not flinch. The marsh's grip tightened slightly as if to reassure her. Justice was already in motion. The mist above the marsh was beginning to thin with the rising sun, but its pale light did nothing to comfort the group huddled near the water's edge. Their boots were caked with mud up to the ankles, their breath quick and uneven. What had started as laughter and taunts was now a series of clipped words and uneasy glances. The landowner's son, brash and smirking even minutes ago, stood closest to the spot where Amara had vanished. He shifted his weight, testing the firmness of the ground, and scowled when his boot sank deeper than he expected. The muck clung to him greedily, sucking at his foot each time he tried to lift it. Just mud, he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed him. One of the others reached to help, but the ground gave a wet, hungry sound, and the boy lurched forward with a startled cry. He yanked at his leg, but the marsh seemed to ripple beneath him, swallowing up his knee, then his thigh. The sound of the mud wasn't just slurping, it was pulling, as if unseen hands beneath the surface were dragging him down. "Grab him!" someone shouted, and two of the men lunged forward, grasping his arms. But the more they pulled, the more the marsh fought back. The muck had claimed him to the hips now, and the suction was unrelenting. His smirk was gone. His eyes darted wildly between them, sweat beading at his brow despite the morning chill. "Get me out," he barked, voice cracking into a plea. The men strained, boots slipping in the wet ground, their own legs sinking as they struggled. A sharp pop of suction sent a spray of muddy water into the air, but instead of loosening, the marsh seemed to take offense at their interference. The boy was yanked down to his waist in one fluid, terrifying motion. Panic rippled through the group. One of the older men swore under his breath and backed away, shaking his head. Another shouted that they should cut him free of his boots, but by the time the idea left his lips, it was too late. Both boots and legs were nearly gone, swallowed whole by the roiling mud. The boy's hands clawed at the empty air now, fingers caked with filth. His screams became raw, desperate, but the marsh didn't care. A final wet, sucking sound drowned him mid-shout, and in the space of a heartbeat he was gone. Only a circle of churning bubbles marked the place where he'd stood. The remaining men stumbled back from the edge, their breaths sharp and ragged, eyes locked on the still quivering patch of water. None of them spoke for several seconds, as if afraid that sound alone might draw the marsh's attention to them next. Somewhere beneath the surface, Amara felt the disturbance ripple through the roots and mud. She didn't need to see what had happened, she knew. The marsh had taken the first of them. And it wasn't finished. The air above the marsh had shifted, heavier, wetter, as though the mist itself had decided to press down upon the conspirators. After the landowner's son vanished, no one dared step forward. They kept to the tufts of grass and firmer ground, trying to steady their breath, but the marsh was patient. The first to go after him was a man standing at the fringe, too distracted by watching the patch where the boy had disappeared. He didn't notice the slow seep of water around his boots until the ground beneath him gave way like rotten cloth. He let out a strangled yell as the mud rose to his knees, then hips, before a sharp jerk pulled him completely under. There was no time for rescue, only the startled gasps of those who watched him vanish without a trace. Panic splintered the group. One man bolted toward the path they had come from, splashing through a shallow pool in his haste. The pool thickened instantly, dragging him down mid-stride. His arms flailed wildly, but every movement only pulled him deeper. His scream became a gurgle, then nothing but ripples. Two more tried to escape together, keeping to the same patch of reeds, but the marsh seemed to sense their desperation. The reeds wrapped around their ankles, bending and twisting like green cords, tugging until they toppled into the sucking mud. One went under quickly, swallowed in a single pull. The other thrashed for a long, awful moment before the water closed over his face. That left only the landowner himself, standing pale and trembling on a shrinking island of solid earth. His breath came in sharp bursts, and his eyes darted around the shifting ground as though it might open under him at any second. "You think this scares me?" he shouted, voice breaking. "You think?" His words cut off when the mud seeped over his boots. He kicked violently, trying to tear free, but the more he fought, the more the marsh gripped him. The mist curled low around his legs and the water reached his knees. He threw his head back and screamed, "Amara! Amara, you hear me?" The sound echoed strangely, carrying across the wetland. Somewhere beneath she heard it clearly, the name tasting different in the air, less accusation, more plea. The marsh ignored his call. The pull grew stronger, jerking him down to the waist. His hands clawed at the air, grasping for something, anything, to anchor him, but the ground gave no mercy. He went in deeper, the suction loud and wet, and his scream fractured into raw terror. When the water reached his chest he tried one last time. "Amara, please," but before he could finish, the mud surged up over his shoulders, his head, and then the ripples swallowed even the sound of his voice. The marsh fell quiet again, the only movement the slow closing of bubbles where he'd stood. The mist thickened once more, curling low and heavy, as though drawing a curtain over the scene. Beneath the roots, Amara exhaled, the marsh's steady heartbeat pulsing all around her. Justice was not loud here, it was deep, patient, and final. Years rolled by, but the day the marsh took the guilty and returned Amara whole never slipped from the village's memory. It settled into the collective mind like a deep-rooted weed, impossible to pull free without tearing something vital. People still crossed the wetlands when necessary, but they did so with a reverence that had not existed before. Every footstep was measured, every word spoken softly, as though the reeds themselves might be listening. No one tried to drain the marsh again. The landowner's grand plan for farmland was never spoken of except in hushed warnings. The council passed an unspoken law: the waters and the ground beneath them were never to be disturbed. What had once been considered useless swamp became sacred territory, marked on every new map with a pale ring of ink. Children grew up hearing the story of the swallowing ground. Parents told it at night in dim firelight, their voices low and slow, letting the pauses stretch in all the right places so the young would feel the weight of it. The tale was not meant to frighten for the sake of fear, but to instill a certain truth: that some places carry their own justice, and some people walk in harmony with such places in ways that cannot be broken. The rules were simple. Never speak ill of the marshes chosen. Never throw stones into its waters. Never cut reeds near the place where the mists gather thickest, for that was where the swallowing ground lay, where Amara had stood, where the guilty had vanished without a trace. As the years passed, the spot took on a strange beauty. Lilies bloomed in summer where none had grown before, their pale petals floating like small lanterns on the dark water. In winter, frost would pattern the surface in delicate, swirling shapes that villagers swore resembled footprints, though they never lasted long enough to be studied. Birds that avoided the rest of the wetland seemed to favor this patch, landing without fear and calling in bright, clear tones. Travelers from other villages came seeking to hear the story for themselves. They would stand at the edge of the swallowing ground, peering into the stillness, hoping to see some sign of what had happened. Some claimed they felt a pull in the air, as though the marsh itself was sizing them up, deciding whether they belonged. A few left abruptly, pale-faced, refusing to speak of what they had sensed. Amara herself was rarely seen after that day. She still lived among the villagers, still tended to the sick, still knew which plants to gather when the winter cough came early. But she walked the marsh paths more than she walked the village streets, and those who encountered her there always found her in the company of cranes, otters, or herons that moved as though she were one of them. People said her eyes had deepened in color, mirroring the shifting hues of the marsh in all its seasons. When she came into the village, no one asked questions. People stepped aside without thinking, offering space without looking directly into her face for too long. They greeted her with quiet respect, some placing offerings of herbs, bread, or polished stones near her basket before she left again. It was not worship exactly, but something close. A recognition that she was no longer entirely theirs, that she belonged to something greater and older. In the minds of the young, Amara became less a person and more a figure out of myth. She was the woman the marsh had spared, the one who could walk its waters without sinking. They whispered that if you strayed too far into the swamp at night with unkind thoughts in your heart, you might hear her footsteps behind you, and if you turned, she would simply be watching, waiting for the marsh to decide. Generations later, long after Amara's hair had silvered and her figure had thinned, the marsh remained untouched. The reeds grew tall around the swallowing ground and no one dared cut them. Even in famine years, when hunger gnawed at the belly of the village, the people would walk past its bounty of fish and birds without taking more than a respectful share from the outer pools. Amara's passing was quiet. One winter morning, she simply did not return from her walk along the water's edge. There was no search party. There were no shouts or tracks to follow. By nightfall, the villagers noticed that the mist above the swallowing ground had thickened, curling like protective arms around an unseen figure. When it cleared days later, the lilies bloomed out of season, white against the frost. From that year forward, no one doubted she had become part of the marsh itself. Some said they heard her voice in the wind that whispered through the reeds. Others swore they saw her silhouette standing in the shallows on certain moonlit nights. Whether truth or fancy, the legend endured. And so the warning endured with it: do not harm those the marsh favors, for the ground remembers, and it does not forgive. The swallowing ground remained marked on every map, every child learned its story before they could swim, and every elder knew its silence was the same silence that had risen the day Amara walked out of the water, untouched. The marsh was no longer just a place, it was a promise, sealed in mud and mist, that the balance between cruelty and justice would always find its way.